Sometimes life strips away everything you've ever loved until you're left with nothing but your dignity and even that feels borrowed. Every person in that great long hall had watched Eydis lose her farm to fire, her sons to raiders, and her honor to family who turned their backs when she needed them most. Now she kneels before the Jarl's throne, whispering the words that break every heart present. I have nothing left. The hall falls silent, waiting for her final shame. Then Ulfar steps forward. This giant warrior who never spoke of home or hearth, who kept his own counsel through countless battles, kneels beside her. Now you have me, he declares to the stunned hall. But why would the most feared warrior in the northlands bind his fate to a woman everyone else abandoned? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord waters like old memories, soft and persistent. As Eydis had once watched from her kitchen window while kneading bread for her 3 sons. That was before the flames, before the raiders, before her brother-in-law Thorvald decided her widowed status made her farm ripe for claiming. The memory felt like touching a wound that refused to heal. Tender and raw, despite the months that had passed, Eydis Ragnarsdottir had been born to better times. Her father owned fertile lands along the river bend, and her marriage to Bjorn the Steadfast had been blessed by both families and the gods themselves. Bjorn had built their farmhouse with his own hands, cutting each timber with the care of a man who knew he was creating something to last generations. Their 3 sons, Eric, Magnus, and Little Leaf, had grown strong on milk and honey, their laughter echoing through halls that smelled of fresh bread and wood smoke. She remembered Eric teaching his younger brothers to fish in the stream that bordered their land, his patience endless as 6-year-old Leif tangled line after line. Magnus, the middle son, had inherited his father's steady hands and quiet wisdom, already showing promise as a craftsman at barely 10 winters. And Bjorn had been the kind of man who settled disputes with words before weapons, whose word was bond enough for any merchant from Bergen to Trondheim. The raids had taken them during the harvest season, when the granaries were full and the men were scattered across distant fields. Danish longships had slipped up the coast like wolves, striking 3 settlements before anyone could sound warning. Bjorn had died defending the grain stores, his body found among 7 enemies he'd taken with him. The boys had tried to reach their mother, but the flames and smoke had turned their own home into a trap. Eydis had survived only because she'd been visiting her sister in the mountains, tending to a difficult birth that had taken 3 days. She returned to find her world reduced to ash and memory, her husband buried alongside their sons in the earth he'd loved so well. The neighbors had helped with the burial rites, speaking kind words about Bjorn's courage and the boy's promise. But kindness couldn't rebuild burned barns or resurrect the dead. For a time, the community had embraced her grief. Widows' rights were sacred, after all, and Bjorn's reputation meant something in these parts. She lived quietly in the small cottage that had served as storage, selling what remained of her livestock and living on the generosity of friends. But kindness has seasons, and winter had come early to her heart. Thorvald had waited exactly 1 year before making his move. Bjorn's younger brother had always been the ambitious one, quick to see opportunity where others saw obligation. He'd approached with legal documents and witnesses, claiming that Bjorn had promised him the land should anything happen to the main family line. The Jarl's court had listened to his arguments about unused fertile ground and the practical need for strong hands to work good soil. A woman alone cannot manage such holdings, Thorvald had argued, his voice pitched to sound reasonable rather than grasping. My brother would want his land productive, not lying fallow while his widow grieves. The words had been carefully chosen, each one a small blade designed to cut away her standing. Eydis had fought the claim, of course. She'd brought her own witnesses, men who remember Bjorn's clear intentions and his love for his wife. But law and justice weren't always the same creature, especially when winter stores were running low and Thorvald's promises of shared prosperity whispered sweetly in the right ears. The Jarl had ruled that a compromise would serve all interests. Eydis could keep the cottage and a small plot for a garden, while the greater holdings would pass to Thorvald's management. The loss had been crushing enough, but worse was to come. Thorvald's wife, Astrid, had never forgotten some imagined slight from years past. Perhaps it was jealousy over Eydis's happy marriage when her own had soured, or resentment that Eydis's sons had been better behaved than her own. Whatever the source, Astrid had begun spreading whispers through the settlement small, poisonous suggestions about how quickly the fire had spread, how convenient Eydis's absence had been, how some women brought misfortune like a curse. The whispers had grown into murmurs, the murmurs into open speculation. Had Eydis somehow caused the raid through her own failings? Had she been unfaithful to Bjorn's memory too quickly? Was her continued presence bringing bad luck to the whole settlement? The questions had no answers, but they didn't need any. Doubt was a weed that grew well in any soil, and fear made excellent fertilizer. By the time Eydis had lost her cottage to mysterious fire, another stroke of misfortune that Astrid was quick to point out, the community's sympathy had withered into suspicious silence. No one wanted to house a woman who might bring calamity with her. No one wanted to hire help from someone the gods seemed to have marked for suffering. That was how Eydis found herself kneeling in the great longhall of Ravnine, reduced to begging for the Jarl's mercy in front of the very people who had once shared bread at her table. But the longhall held another figure that night, one whose own story had been written in blood and salt across the western seas. Ulfar Ironside had returned from his voyages 6 months earlier, and the man who came back was not quite the same one who had left 3 years before. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders that could bear the weight of the world and hands scarred by countless battles, Ulfar had always been a figure of legend among the warriors of Ravenheim. His axe, Grimnir's Bite, had tasted blood on 5 different shores, and his skill in battle was matched only by his silence away from it. Men spoke of him in whispers, sharing stories of how he'd held a bridge single-handed against 20 Danish berserkers, or how he'd walked alone into a Saxon stronghold and emerged 3 days later with their chieftain's head. Yet something had changed during his last voyage to the Western Islands. The other warriors who'd returned with him spoke in careful terms about what they'd seen in those distant lands, about settlements burned not by raiders, but by their own neighbors, about children orphaned not by foreign swords, but by petty feuds that had grown into bloodbaths. Ulfar's axe, once never far from his reach, now hung silent on his belt like a sleeping serpent. He'd taken lodgings in the longhall, but spoke to no one unless directly addressed. He ate when food was placed before him, participated in ceremonies when duty demanded, but his eyes held a distance that spoke of a man looking inward rather than outward. The other warriors had tried to draw him out, eager to hear tales of Western adventures and foreign treasures. But Ulfar had shared nothing beyond the bare necessities. The voyage had been successful. The enemy had been defeated. The survivors had been brought home safely. When pressed for details about the gold they'd surely captured or the glory they'd won, he would simply nod toward the younger men and suggest they tell those stories better than he could. Some said the silence was the mark of a man who'd seen too much killing. Others whispered that he'd been cursed by foreign witches or had his warrior's heart stolen by some Western enchantment. But those who watched most carefully noticed something different in his silence. Not the emptiness of a broken man, but the quietude of someone listening for something he hadn't yet found. The longhall itself was the heart of Ravenheim's power, a massive structure that could hold 300 souls when the need arose. Its walls were lined with shields and banners from a dozen victories, its long tables scarred by countless knives and ale horns, The high seat where Jarl Olafsson held court was carved from a single oak that had supposedly grown on this spot for 500 years, and the fire pit in the center burned, with flames that were never allowed to die completely. It was here that justice was dispensed, disputes settled, and the community's collective will given voice. It was here that young warriors swore their oaths and old ones passed down their wisdom. It was here that Eydis Ragnarsdottir had come to make her final plea, and here that Ulfar Ironside would make the choice that would reshape both their destinies. The other witnesses that night formed a cross-section of Ravnheim's society. There was Thorvald himself, dressed in his finest cloak, and accompanied by men whose loyalty had been purchased with promises of future prosperity. Astrid sat among the women, her face a careful mask of concerned propriety that barely concealed her satisfaction. The Jarl's advisors clustered near the high seat, their expressions reflecting the weight of having to balance justice against practical necessity. Among the warriors, opinions were divided. Some felt sympathy for the widow's plight, but saw no practical solution to her problems. Others whispered that a woman who had lost so much so quickly might indeed be cursed, and that helping her could bring that curse upon themselves. Still others simply saw it as none of their concern. The affairs of farmers and land disputes held little interest for men who lived by sword and storm. But all of them, from the highest born to the humblest thrall, would remember this night for the rest of their lives. They would remember the sound of Eydis's voice breaking as she spoke her final words. They would remember the weight of silence that followed. And most of all, they would remember the moment when Ulfar Ironside stepped forward and changed the course of 2 lives with 4 simple words. The stage was set, the players in position, and the first act of an unlikely partnership about to begin. In a world where strength was measured in sword strokes and worth calculated in gold, 2 broken souls were about to discover that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in fighting, but in choosing to begin again. The longhall had fallen into that particular silence that comes before judgments are passed, when every breath feels measured and every heartbeat sounds loud as thunder. Eydis remained kneeling on the cold stone floor, her torn cloak spread around her like the wings of a fallen bird. The fabric had once been deep blue, dyed with precious berries and woven with care by her own hands during the early years of her marriage. Now it bore the stains of ash and hardship, its edges frayed by months of rough sleeping and desperate wandering. Jarl Olafsson shifted in his great chair, the ancient oak creaking under his weight. He was a fair man by most measures, but fairness and kindness were different creatures entirely. His weathered face showed the burden of having to balance law against mercy, practical necessity against human compassion. The settlement's welfare came first. It had to, when winter was always lurking just beyond the next season, and survival depended on difficult choices. Eydis Ragnarsdottir. The Jarl's voice carried the formal weight of official pronouncement. You have brought your petition before this assembly. You ask for aid when you have no kin to speak for you, no husband to provide, no sons to work in your name. Each word fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of uncomfortable recognition throughout the hall. Thorvald stepped forward then, his movement calculated to appear reluctant rather than eager. My lord, my brother's widow has suffered greatly, this is true. But suffering alone does not create obligation for the community. We have done what we could, offered what we might. But there are limits to charity when resources are not unlimited. Astrid nodded gravely from her place among the women, her expression perfectly crafted to suggest sorrowful agreement with painful necessity. The winter was hard on all of us, she added, her voice pitched to carry just the right note of regretful practicality. And there have been signs. What signs? Eydis's voice cracked like thin ice, desperation finally breaking through the careful dignity she tried to maintain. She raised her head to look directly at her accusers, and for a moment the firelight caught the remnants of the beauty that had once made Bjorn count himself the luckiest man in 3 settlements. The fires that follow you, Astrid continued smoothly. First your farm, then your cottage. Crops fail where you've walked. Children take fever after you've passed their homes. Some would call it coincidence, but others see patterns where they appear. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a green fire, choking and impossible to dispel with mere words. Several people in the hall shifted uncomfortably, some nodding slightly while others looked away. Fear was a powerful thing, especially when winter's bite was still fresh in memory and the next growing season felt uncertain. Eydis felt something break inside her chest, not her heart that had shattered months ago, but something deeper. Her spirit, perhaps, or simply her will to keep fighting against currents that seemed determined to drown her. The tears came then, not the angry tears of protest, but the quiet ones of surrender. I have nothing left, she whispered, the words barely audible above the crackling of the central fire. Yet somehow they carried to every corner of the hall, settling into the silence like snow falling on already frozen ground. Nothing left to give, nothing left to lose, nothing left to hope for. The admission hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Here was a woman who had lost husband, children, home, and livelihood, now acknowledging that even her will to continue had been stripped away. It was the kind of naked honesty that made everyone uncomfortable because it reminded them how thin the ice was beneath all their own certainties. Jarl Olafsson's expression softened slightly, but his duty remained unchanged. Eydis, he said gently, I cannot create resources where none exist. The community has extended what aid it could. Perhaps it would be best if you sought shelter in another settlement, one where your history does not. Now you have me. The words cut through the Jarl's careful dismissal like an axe through kindling. Every head in the hall turned toward the source of that deep, quiet voice. Ulfar Ironside stood in the shadows near the great doors, his massive frame catching the firelight so that he seemed to emerge from darkness itself. For 3 heartbeats, no one moved. Ulfar had spoken perhaps a dozen words in public since his return, and never had he inserted himself into community disputes. He was a warrior, not a farmer or merchant. His concerns were supposed to be with battles and voyages, not with the domestic troubles of widowed women. But now he stepped forward, each footfall deliberate and measured. The crowd parted before him without conscious thought, the way people instinctively move aside for forces of nature. His hand rested easily on his belt, nowhere near his axe, but the weapon's presence seemed to hum in the air around him anyway. Thorvald's face went pale, then flushed red. What did you say? Ulfar stopped directly in front of Eydis, towering over her kneeling form like a mountain over a valley. Then, to the absolute amazement of everyone present, the giant warrior lowered himself to one knee, bringing his eyes level with hers. When he spoke again, his voice carried clearly through the stunned silence. Now you have me, he repeated, each word distinct and final as carved runes. My shield, my name, my protection. If any man would claim you have nothing, let him say so while standing before me. The hall erupted in gasps and murmurs, voices rising in disbelief and confusion. Warriors who had served alongside Ulfar stared in shock. Women whispered urgent questions to their neighbors. Even the thralls stopped their work to witness what seemed impossible. Eydis looked up into Ulfar's face, searching for some sign of jest or temporary madness. But his gray eyes held only steady certainty, like stone foundations that would not shift regardless of what storms raged above. Why? She whispered. Because you deserve better than this, he answered simply. Because strength that is not used to protect the worthy is merely cruelty wearing different clothes. Because I have walked far enough to know that courage often wears the face of a broken woman who still tries to stand with dignity. Thorvald found his voice first among the shocked observers. You cannot be serious. A man of your standing, binding yourself to this. He gestured vaguely at Eydis. His words failing him, Ulfar rose to his full height, his movement fluid despite his size. When he turned his attention to Thorvald, the temperature in the hall seemed to drop several degrees. "Finish your thought," he said softly. "Tell us all what this woman is that makes her unworthy of protection." The challenge in those words was unmistakable. Thorvald was no coward, but he was also no fool. He had seen what Ulfar's axe could do to armed warriors in their prime. Insulting a woman under Ulfar's protection would be the same as calling the giant out to personal combat, and that was a fight only the dead could win. "I meant no disrespect," Thorvald said carefully, though his jaw remained tight with anger. "But the practical matters. She has no dowry, no property, no. She has me." Ulfar interrupted, extending his hand to help Eydis rise. "That will have to be enough." As Eydis placed her work-roughened hand in his battle-scarred one, something passed between them that had nothing to do with marriage contracts or social obligations. It was recognition, one soul acknowledging another's worth when the rest of the world had forgotten how to see it. The Jarl cleared his throat, struggling to regain control of proceedings that had veered far from any path he had anticipated. "This is highly irregular. There are customs, protocols. There are also older laws," Ulfar replied calmly. "The right of a warrior to claim protection over any who request it. The duty of strength to serve justice when the weak are abandoned by those who should shelter them. I invoke these rights before this assembly." The ancient laws he cited were indeed older than the current customs, reaching back to the earliest days when survival depended on warriors who would stand between the helpless and the darkness. Few had invoked them in living memory, but they remained valid, carved into the very foundations of their society. Eydis stood now with Ulfar's support, her legs unsteady but her spine straight. The torn cloak that had symbolized her defeat now seemed transformed into a battle banner, tattered but still flying. For the first time in months, she was not alone. The 3 days following Ulfar's declaration passed like walking through a dream, where familiar faces wore unfamiliar expressions. Eydis found herself installed in a small but comfortable chamber adjacent to Ulfar's quarters in the longhall, a space that had previously housed visiting jarls and honored guests. The room came with a narrow bed topped by clean furs, a wooden chest for belongings she didn't possess, and a window that looked out over the fjord where morning mist danced above dark waters. She had expected whispers, and there were plenty of those. What she hadn't anticipated was the careful distance that had opened between her and nearly everyone else in the settlement. Not hostile exactly, but cautious, as if people were, trying to determine what her new status meant before committing themselves to any particular response. Ulfar's silver arm ring sat heavy on her wrist, where he had placed it during the formal ceremony Jarl Olafsson had insisted upon. The twisted metal was warm against her skin, and she found herself touching it throughout the day like a talisman against uncertainty. It was a warrior's ring, worn smooth by years of battles, and it marked her as clearly under his protection as if she wore his colors into combat. The ring had belonged to his father, Ulfar had told her quietly after the ceremony. Eric Ironside had worn it through 30 years of raiding and trading, and it had been passed down when age finally claimed him. "My mother said it brought him home from every voyage," Ulfar had explained, fastening the clasp with surprising gentleness for such large hands. "Perhaps it will bring you home too." But where was home for a woman whose family lay buried and whose hearth had turned to ash? Eydis wasn't certain, but for the first time in months, the question felt like one worth exploring rather than a wound worth avoiding. She had tried to speak with Ulfar about the practical arrangements of their new situation, but he proved surprisingly elusive. He rose before dawn each morning and spent his days training with the younger warriors, maintaining weapons or walking the settlement's boundaries in weather that would keep most people huddled near their fires. When evening brought him back to the longhall, he was polite but distant, ensuring she had everything she needed before retiring to his own chamber. It was clear he was giving her space to adjust, but it was equally clear he had no more idea how to navigate this arrangement than she did. They were two people who had made a commitment born of desperate nobility rather than practical planning. And now both were discovering that good intentions required considerable translation to become workable reality. The other women in the settlement maintained careful politeness when they encountered her, but Eydis could feel their uncertainty like a chill wind. Astrid had grown notably quiet since the ceremony, her usual stream of commentary reduced to terse pleasantries when social necessity demanded interaction. The loss of her primary target seemed to have left her temporarily without direction, though Eydis suspected that state wouldn't last long. Among the warriors, reactions varied more widely. Some of the younger men clearly viewed Ulfar's choice as romantic in the old style, the kind of gesture that belonged in skaldic poems about heroes who chose honor over practical advantage. They would nod respectfully when they saw Eydis, and seemed genuinely pleased that their admired leader had found someone worthy of his protection. The older warriors were more reserved. They respected Ulfar's right to make his own choices, but they also understood the complications that could arise when personal decisions intersected with community dynamics. Several had approached Ulfar privately. She'd seen them in earnest conversation near the practice grounds, though whatever counsel they offered remained between them. Thorvald had made himself scarce since the ceremony, though his absence felt more strategic than coincidental. Eydis suspected he was consulting with allies, and possibly seeking advice from other settlements about how to respond to this unexpected development. A man who had worked so carefully to claim her lands wouldn't abandon his plans, simply because she now wore a warrior's protection. On the fourth morning, Eydis woke to find a package wrapped in oiled cloth sitting on her windowsill. Inside was an eating knife with a carved bone handle, its blade sharp enough to cut parchment and balanced for a woman's hand. A note written in careful runes read, "Every person should have tools suited to their needs. May this serve you well." "You." She turned the knife over in her hands, studying the craftsmanship. The bone handle was carved with interlacing patterns that resembled the designs she'd once worked into her finest weavings. Someone had put considerable thought and skill into making this blade, and she suspected she knew who when she found Ulfar in the practice yard that afternoon. He was teaching a group of boys the proper stance for sword work. His patience with their clumsy attempts was remarkable for someone whose reputation was built on devastating efficiency in combat. He corrected their grips with gentle adjustments and praised small improvements with genuine enthusiasm. "The knife is beautiful," she said when the lesson ended, and the boys had scattered to their other duties. "Did you make it yourself?" He nodded, suddenly looking uncertain despite his massive frame. "I thought you might need something of your own. The handle is carved from elk bone. It should wear well. The patterns match ones I used in my weaving," she observed. "That's not coincidental, is it?" A slight smile creased his weather-beaten face. "I may have paid attention to the tapestries in the longhall. Your work was always the finest displayed there." The compliment caught her off guard, partly because it was unexpected and partly because it reminded her that she had once been skilled at something other than enduring loss. She had forgotten that her tapestries hung in the place of honor, or perhaps she had trained herself not to notice them as reminders of better times. "I haven't woven anything in months," she admitted. "My loom was destroyed in the fire, and I haven't had access to good wool since. Would you like to again?" His question was carefully neutral, but she could hear genuine interest beneath the casual tone. "I would," she said, surprised to discover the truth of it. "I used to love the rhythm of it, the way patterns emerged from simple threads. It made me feel like I was creating something lasting." "Then we'll find you a loom," Ulfar said, with the same certainty he'd used when declaring his protection. "And wool, good wool, not the rough stuff the merchants try to pass off on people who don't know better." It was such a simple promise, but it hit her with unexpected force. Someone was listening to what she wanted, rather than telling her what she should accept. Someone was thinking about her happiness, rather than her usefulness. The feeling was so foreign after months of scrambling for basic survival that she had to blink back sudden tears. "You don't have to provide everything for me," she said quietly. "I can work, earn my keep somehow." "I know you can," Ulfar replied. "But you don't have to prove your worth through suffering. You've done enough of that for several lifetimes." As they walked back toward the longhall together, Eydis felt something she hadn't experienced since before the raids. The sense that tomorrow might hold possibilities beyond mere endurance. It was a fragile feeling, like the first green shoots after a hard winter. But it was real. The loom arrived on a gray morning when the wind carried the scent of distant rain and the promise of changing weather. Eydis watched from her window as two of the settlement's craftsmen carefully maneuvered the wooden frame through the longhall's main doors, their movements cautious and respectful of both the delicate mechanisms and the unusual circumstances of its delivery. That it wasn't just any loom. She realized as they set it up in the alcove that Ulfar had arranged near the great hearth. This was Sigrid the Weaver's personal frame, the one she'd used to create the ceremonial banners that hung in the Jarl's hall. Sigrid had been the settlement's master weaver until her death 2 winters past, and her tools had been carefully stored ever since, waiting for someone worthy to inherit them. "How did you manage this?" Eydis asked when Ulfar appeared at her shoulder, his presence both comforting and unsettling in the way she was learning to expect. "I spoke with her daughter," he replied simply. "Thora has no talent for weaving, her skills run to healing herbs instead. She said her mother would have wanted the loom to sing again rather than gathering dust in storage." Eydis ran her fingers along the smooth wood, feeling the slight depressions worn by years of Sigrid's hands. The frame was seasoned oak, aged to a warm honey color, and polished by countless hours of use. The heddles were strung with silk thread, precious and perfectly maintained. This wasn't just a tool. It was an inheritance of craft and tradition. "What did you promise in return?" she asked, knowing that such generosity rarely came without cost. Ulfar's smile was almost sheepish. A new roof for her herb-drying shed before the next storm season, and perhaps a few hours helping her gather ingredients from the higher meadows when spring comes properly. The image of the giant warrior delicately picking medicinal plants made Eydis laugh. The first genuine laughter she'd felt in months. The sound surprised them both, bright and unexpected in the often solemn atmosphere of the longhall. "You find that amusing?" Ulfar asked, but his tone held more pleasure than offense. "I find it perfect," she admitted. A man feared across 3 kingdoms, reduced to harvesting flowers for healing potions. "There's poetry in it. There's practicality in it," he corrected, but his eyes held warmth. "Thora's skill with healing herbs has saved more warriors than my axe ever will. Her work deserves proper support." As the days passed, Eydis found herself settling into rhythms she hadn't realized she'd missed. The morning ritual of checking the warp threads, the gentle tension of working weft through the pattern, the slow emergence of design from patient repetition, all of it felt like reclaiming a piece of herself that had been buried under months of survival and grief. Her first project was modest, a length of wool cloth dyed in the soft browns and greens that reminded her of forest paths in autumn. Nothing fancy or ambitious, just solid weaving to remind her hands of skills they'd temporarily forgotten. But even this simple work drew attention. Gudrun, the Jarl's wife, paused to watch one afternoon as Eydis worked the shuttle through increasingly complex patterns. "Your tension is remarkably even," she observed. "Sigrid always said that was the mark of a true weaver, the ability to maintain consistency through hours of work." "She taught me when I was young," Eydis replied, not looking up from the emerging cloth. "She said patience was a virtue that showed in every thread." "Indeed." Gudrun studied the work more closely. "That's a variation on the tree pattern, isn't it?" I haven't seen that particular interpretation before. Eydis paused in her weaving, suddenly self-conscious. I developed it years ago. I thought the traditional version was too rigid. Real trees don't grow in perfect symmetry. No, they don't, Gudrun agreed thoughtfully. This is much more natural, more alive. She hesitated, then added, I have been thinking about new hangings for the feast hall. Perhaps we might discuss a commission once you've settled back into the work? The offer was significant beyond its practical value. Gudrun was not merely the Jarl's wife, but a powerful figure in her own right, whose approval could reshape how the community viewed Eydis's presence among them. A commission for the feast hall would mark her as a valued artisan rather than a mere object of Ulfar's protection. I would be honored, Eydis replied carefully, though I should warn you that my recent work may lack the refinement of my earlier pieces. Grief has a way of making hands uncertain. Grief also has a way of adding depth to art, Gudrun countered. Some of the most moving pieces I've seen were created by those who understood loss intimately. Perhaps that understanding would serve the feast hall well. After Gudrun departed, Eydis found her hands trembling slightly as she returned to the loom. The prospect of creating something significant again, something that would be seen and appreciated by the community, felt both thrilling and terrifying. She had spent so long focused on basic survival that she'd forgotten the particular anxiety of artistic ambition. Deep thoughts? Ulfar's voice interrupted her reverie. He had developed a habit of checking on her progress in the late afternoons, usually bringing ale or warm bread to share while she worked. Gudrun wants to commission feast hall hangings, she said, accepting the horn of ale he offered. I'm not sure my skills are ready for something that ambitious. What would make them ready? He asked, settling onto a nearby bench with the careful grace of a man who knew his size could make others uncomfortable. Practice, time, confidence that I remember how to translate vision into reality. She took a sip of ale and found it was the good stuff, not the rough brew usually served to the general populace. Another small kindness from her unlikely protector. The vision is still there, Ulfar observed, gesturing toward her current work. I can see it in every row you've completed. The hands remember what the heart holds dear. His words carried the weight of personal experience, and she wondered what arts or skills he might have set aside in favor of more warlike pursuits. There was a sensitivity in his observations that spoke of someone who understood the relationship between craft and identity. What did you do before the raiding? She asked impulsively. Before you became Ulfar Ironside the warrior? He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice held the distant quality it took on when he discussed his past. I built things, he said simply. Boats mostly, but also buildings when the need arose. My father said I had hands for wood, that I could see what a tree wanted to become and help it find that shape. The revelation explained much about his gentle handling of tools and his appreciation for craftsmanship. It also suggested depths to his character that his fearsome reputation had overshadowed. Do you miss it? She asked softly. Every day, he admitted. But some choices change us beyond easy return. I became what the world needed me to become, but perhaps there's still time to remember what I once chose to be. 3 weeks into autumn, when the leaves had turned gold and the nights carried winter's first whispered threats, Thorvald made his move. He arrived at the longhall during the evening meal. Accompanied by 2 men, Eydis didn't recognize travelers by their dust-stained cloaks and weathered faces. Their presence commanded immediate attention, not through size or bluster, but through the quiet confidence of those accustomed to being heard. Jarl Olafsson, Thorvald called formally as he approached the high seat. I bring witnesses to a matter of law that requires the assembly's attention. Eydis felt her stomach clench with familiar dread. She had been weaving when the commotion began, her shuttle moving steadily through a complex pattern of blues and silvers. that would eventually become part of Gudrun's commissioned hangings. The work had brought her peace, the rhythm allowing her mind to find patterns larger than individual threads. Now that peace shattered like ice under a hammer blow, Ulfar appeared at her side, so quickly and quietly that she wondered if he'd been watching for exactly this kind of trouble. His hand rested lightly on her shoulder, a gesture that looked casual but felt protective. "What witnesses?" the Jarl asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer wouldn't bring good news. The two strangers stepped forward. The older of them, a man with silver threading his dark beard, spoke with the careful precision of someone accustomed to legal proceedings. "I am Håkon Eriksson of Jorvik Settlement. This is my companion, Olaf Thorson. We were present 3 years ago when certain agreements were made regarding landholdings in this territory." Eydis's heart began beating so hard she was certain everyone in the hall could hear it. 3 years ago, that would have been the last time Bjorn had traveled to Jorvik for the autumn trading. He had gone with grain and wool, returning with silver and stories of profitable deals. She remembered his satisfaction with the journey, his plans for expanding their holdings based on the connections he'd made. "What agreements?" Gudrun asked sharply. The Jarl's wife had developed a protective interest in Eydis since commissioning the feast hall hangings, and her voice carried an edge that suggested trouble for anyone who threatened her plans. Håkon reached into his travel pouch and withdrew a piece of parchment, its edges worn but the seal still intact. A contract witnessed and sealed, stating that Bjorn the Steadfast agreed to sell his Riverbend holdings to one Thorvald Bjornsson, to be completed upon certain conditions being met. The hall erupted in surprised murmurs. Even those who had supported Thorvald's earlier claim looked shocked by this development. A sealed contract was far more serious than the informal family agreements he had previously cited. "That's impossible," Eydis said, her voice cutting through the noise with desperate certainty. "Bjorn would never have agreed to sell our land. That was our children's inheritance, our security. He would have discussed such a decision with me." "Perhaps," Håkon replied with professional neutrality, "but the document is clear and properly witnessed. The sale was contingent on certain conditions, that Thorvald's family provide care for, Bjorn's widow and children should misfortune befall them, and that the land remain productive under proper management." Thorvald stepped forward, his expression a careful mixture of regret and righteousness. "I have tried to fulfill those obligations. I offered shelter, assistance, reasonable support for my brother's widow, but she refused practical arrangements and chose instead to pursue this current situation." The implications hit Eydis like physical blows. If such a contract existed, her marriage to Bjorn had been built on deception. Her husband had secretly planned to abandon their children's inheritance while presenting himself as a devoted family man. The land that had been stolen from her through legal maneuvering would actually have been stolen from her through her husband's betrayal. "I don't believe it," she said, but even as the words left her lips, doubt crept in like cold water through a cracked hull. Bjorn had been secretive about his trading business, claiming he didn't want to worry her with details. He had made that final journey to Jorvik alone, saying it would be faster without the wagon train they usually took together. Ulfar's hand tightened on her shoulder, and when he spoke, his voice carried the deadly quiet that had once preceded legendary battles. "May I examine this document?" Håkon hesitated, clearly preferring to deal with established authority rather than unpredictable warriors. But Ulfar's reputation preceded him, and refusing such a reasonable request would look suspicious. "Of course," Håkon said, extending the parchment. "Though I should note that the seal remains intact and the witnesses' marks are clear." Ulfar studied the document carefully, his eyes moving slowly across every line of text and every mark on the parchment. His examination was thorough and methodical. The attention to detail of someone who understood that documents could be weapons as deadly as any blade. "The seal is genuine," he said finally, his tone giving nothing away. The parchment is the right age, properly prepared. The ink has aged naturally. He looked up at Hakon with eyes that seemed to see through flesh and bone to whatever lay beneath. But there's something wrong with the writing. What do you mean? The Jarl asked. Ulfar handed the document to Eydis, pointing to specific lines of text. Look at the formation of the letters. See how the loops in the G letters are formed. How the crosses on the T marks are positioned. Eydis studied the writing, trying to see what Ulfar had noticed. The text looked official enough to her untrained eye, but as she focused on individual letters, patterns began to emerge. The writing is too uniform, she said slowly. When Bjorn wrote quickly, his letters slanted differently, and he always made his R marks with a distinctive curl. These are too straight. Precisely, Ulfar confirmed. This was written by someone copying Bjorn's hand rather than Bjorn himself. Someone skilled enough to mimic the general appearance, but not careful enough to replicate the small personal habits that mark a man's true writing. Hakon's professional composure slipped slightly. That's a serious accusation. I assure you, I witnessed this document being signed in my own hall. Then you witnessed a forgery, Ulfar replied bluntly. The question is whether you were complicit in creating it or merely foolish enough to be deceived by it. The challenge was unmistakable, and Hakon's hand moved instinctively toward his belt before he remembered where he was and who he was facing. Olaf, his companion, had gone pale and was edging slightly away from his partner. Thorvald attempted to regain control of the situation. These are wild accusations based on speculation about letter formation. The document has been properly witnessed and sealed by men who may have been paid to lie, Ulfar interrupted, or threatened into cooperation, or simply fooled by a clever forgery designed to steal a dead man's property from his widow. The hall had gone completely silent, everyone recognizing that the evening had moved far beyond simple legal disputes into territory where honor and reputation hung in the balance. Accusations of forgery and false witness were not matters that could be settled through peaceful discussion. The confrontation that followed stretched through the night like a battle fought with words instead of weapons. Jarl Olafsson, recognizing that accusations of forgery could tear the community apart if handled poorly, declared that the matter required thorough investigation before any judgment could be rendered. We will examine all evidence, question all witnesses, and seek truth wherever it may lead, he announced. But such work requires time and careful consideration. Until this matter is resolved, all claims to the disputed lands are suspended. Thorvald's face darkened at this pronouncement, but he couldn't object without appearing to rush justice. Hakon and his companion were assigned quarters in the longhall under what amounted to protective custody, ostensibly for their safety as valuable witnesses, but actually to prevent them from departing before their testimony could be thoroughly examined. As the assembly dispersed into worried clusters of conversation, Eydis found herself walking the settlement's perimeter paths in the pre-dawn darkness, unable to bear the confines of walls when her mind felt like a storm at sea. The revelation of the forged document had shaken her more than she cared to admit, not because she believed it genuine, but because it forced her to confront how little she had actually known about some aspects of her husband's affairs. Bjorn had been a good man, she remained certain of that. But good men could make poor decisions when pressed by circumstances she might never understand. Had there been debts she didn't know about? Pressures from creditors or trading partners? Had he felt trapped into agreements he couldn't bring himself to discuss with her? You're walking the paths like a sentry expecting attack. Ulfar's voice emerged from the shadows near the storage buildings. He had followed her, she realized, but at a respectful distance that gave her space to think. Perhaps I am, she replied, not slowing her pace. I keep feeling like the ground beneath my feet might give way at any moment. The document is false, he said with quiet certainty. I've seen enough forgeries to recognize the signs. Someone went to considerable effort to create a convincing lie, But lies have weaknesses the truth doesn't. But what if there's some truth buried in the lie? The question had been gnawing at her since the evening's revelations. What if Bjorn did make some kind of agreement with Thorvald? Not necessarily what that document claims, but something that's been twisted into this shape. Ulfar was quiet for several steps, considering her words. Would it change how you feel about him if he had? I don't know, she admitted. We promised each other honesty in all things when we wed. If he kept secrets about something that affected our children's future, she broke off, unable to finish the thought. He kept you and your sons fed and secure for 15 years, Ulfar pointed out gently. Whatever arrangements he made, they served their purpose. A man facing uncertain times might make contingency plans without burdening his family with worries about possibilities that might never come to pass. They had reached the settlement's eastern boundary, where a stone marker carved with protective runes stood guard against whatever troubles might emerge from the forest beyond. Eydis stopped there, resting her hand on the weathered stone as if drawing strength from its steadfast presence. You have remarkable faith in people's good intentions, she said. Is that wisdom gained from experience or innocence preserved despite it? Neither, Ulfar replied. It's pragmatism. I've seen what happens when communities turn on themselves based on suspicion and mistrust. The damage spreads like fire, consuming everything that took generations to build. Sometimes you have to choose to believe in people's better nature, not because it's always justified, but because the alternative is worse. His words carried the weight of hard-earned knowledge, and she found herself studying his profile in the growing dawnlight. There were stories written in the lines around his eyes, experiences that had shaped his understanding of human nature through trials she could only imagine. What did you see in the western lands that changed you? She asked, the question emerging before she could consider whether it was too personal. Ulfar was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice held the distant quality of someone revisiting painful memories. A settlement much like this one, he said slowly. Prosperous, well-defended, filled with good people who had built something worth protecting. They had a dispute over water rights that should have been settled through negotiation and compromise. What happened? Pride and suspicion poisoned the well of community trust. Accusations led to counter-accusations. Old grievances were dragged into daylight and used as weapons. Families split along lines of ancient loyalty. Before the season ended, neighbors were burning each other's homes and fighting blood feuds over insults, both real and imagined. Eydis felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. How did it end? With graves, Ulfar said simply. Too many graves, and a settlement that never recovered its former prosperity. The survivors scattered to other places, carrying their bitterness with them like an infection that spread to new communities. And you were there as a warrior? I was there as someone who chose the wrong side based on incomplete information and personal loyalty rather than careful judgment. My acts contributed to the destruction of something beautiful. And I swore afterward that I would never again let pride override wisdom when it came to matters of community welfare. The confession hung between them like morning mist, visible but fragile. Eydis understood now why Ulfar had chosen to protect her, not from romantic impulse or simple kindness, but from hard-won knowledge about what happened when communities abandoned their most vulnerable members. Is that why you've been so quiet since your return? She asked. You've been trying to avoid the kind of involvement that led to those mistakes? Partly, he admitted. But also because I was looking for something worth protecting rather than something worth destroying. Fighting is easy. Any fool with a sharp blade can cause damage. Building something better requires more skill than I possessed when I left here. They began walking back toward the settlement as full daylight painted the fjord waters silver. The morning shift of fishermen were preparing their boats, and smoke was beginning to rise from cooking fires throughout the community. It was a peaceful scene that belied the tensions simmering beneath the surface. Thorvald won't give up easily, Eydis observed. He's invested too much in claiming those lands to walk away from a few questions about document authenticity. No, he won't, Ulfar agreed. But he's also made the mistake of escalating this beyond a simple property dispute. Forgery accusations carry serious consequences. If we can prove he's behind it, he'll face exile or worse. And if we can't prove it? Ulfar's smile held no humor. Then we'll have to get creative about finding other solutions. Sometimes the truth needs help revealing itself. The truth arrived on an unseasonably warm afternoon when the first snow of winter was already melting into muddy rivulets, delivered by the last person anyone expected to bring it. Astrid appeared at the longhall doors, carrying a wooden chest that looked far too heavy for her slight frame, her face bearing the particular pallor of someone who had spent sleepless nights wrestling with conscience. "I need to speak with the Jarl," she announced to the hall at large, her voice carrying an unusual tremor. "About the document. About my husband's claims. About things that should have been said long ago." Eydis looked up from her weaving, the shuttle frozen in her hands as she recognized something in Astrid's demeanor that she had never seen before, genuine remorse tinged with desperate determination. The hall fell silent as Jarl Olafsson emerged from his private chambers, summoned by the commotion. "What brings you here, Astrid?" the Jarl asked, his tone carefully neutral, though his eyes were sharp with interest. Astrid set the chest down with obvious effort, then straightened to face the assembled crowd. Her hands were shaking, but her voice grew steadier as she spoke. "This chest contains letters and documents that belong to my husband. Things he thought were hidden, but which I found while preparing for winter storage." Thorvald, who had been conferring quietly with Hakon near the far wall, went white as death. "Astrid, what are you doing?" "There's nothing in my personal correspondence that concerns this assembly, isn't there?" she replied, her voice gaining strength from his obvious distress. "Then you won't mind if the Jarl examines these practice sheets where you copied Bjorn's handwriting over and over until you could mimic his signature. Or these letters from the forger in Jorvik, who helped you create that false contract. Or this accounting of how much you paid Hakon and Olaf to support your lies." The hall erupted in shocked exclamations and angry murmurs. Hakon bolted for the doors, but 3 of the Jarl's men blocked his path with casual efficiency. Olaf simply sank onto a bench and buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with what might have been relief or despair. "These are desperate fabrications," Thorvald snarled, but his voice carried the hollow ring of a man whose lies had finally caught up with him. "My wife has been listening to poisonous gossip and letting it affect her judgment. Have I?" Astrid opened the chest and withdrew a sheaf of parchment covered in careful script. "Then explain this letter where you boast to your contact in Jorvik about how easily you've manipulated the community into supporting your claims. Or this one where you express frustration that the widow refuses to die of shame like a proper woman should." Eydis felt the blood drain from her face at those words. The casual cruelty of Thorvald's expectations that she should simply disappear rather than complicate his theft hit her like a physical blow. But worse was the realization of how close she had come to fulfilling his wishes through despair alone. Ulfar stepped forward, his movement drawing every eye in the hall. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command. "May I examine these documents?" Astrid nodded wordlessly, handing over the entire collection. As Ulfar began reading, his expression grew progressively darker. Finally, he looked up at Thorvald with eyes like winter storms. "You didn't just forge one document," he said, his voice deadly calm. "You've been planning this theft for years. These letters show you were already plotting to claim Bjorn's lands before the raids ever happened. You were hoping for his death in battle so you could present your false contracts without the inconvenience of contradicting testimony." "Those letters prove nothing," Thorvald protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Personal correspondence can be misinterpreted, can it? Ulfar held up a particular parchment. What about this one where you write, "If the raids don't solve my problem naturally, perhaps misfortune can be arranged"? Were we misinterpreting your hope that Eydis would die conveniently? The implications of those words hit the assembly like thunder. Several people gasped audibly, and angry voices began rising throughout the hall. To wish for someone's death was one thing. Plenty of people harbored dark thoughts they never acted upon. But to suggest a misfortune might be arranged crossed the line into something far more sinister. Astrid spoke into the shocked silence, her voice now steady with grim purpose. There's more. Records of payments to men who set fires in carefully chosen locations. Correspondence with raiders who were given information about which settlements would be lightly defended during harvest season. The final revelation struck like a physical blow. The hall went completely silent as the full scope of Thorvald's betrayal became clear. He hadn't simply stolen from his brother's widow. He had collaborated with the very raiders who killed his brother and nephews. Eydis found herself unable to breathe properly, the magnitude of the betrayal overwhelming her ability to process it. Bjorn hadn't been hiding shameful agreements. He had been betrayed by his own blood, murdered by enemies his brother had guided to their door. Her sons had died not because of random misfortune, but because their uncle had sold their lives for land and gold. "You're lying," Thorvald said desperately, but his denial sounded hollow even to himself. "My wife has been poisoned against me by jealousy and spite." These documents could easily be forgeries themselves. Could they? Jarl Olafsson had taken the papers from Ulfar and was examining them with the careful attention of someone who understood their significance. "These appear to be written in your hand, Thorvald. The letter formations match samples of your verified writing that I have in my own records." Astrid stepped forward again, her face now showing not just remorse, but anger. "I've lived with the knowledge of what you did for 2 years. I've watched you spread lies about a woman whose family you helped murder. Also, you could profit from their deaths. I can't carry this burden any longer. Why now?" Eydis asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you've known all this time, why speak now?" Astrid's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "Because I watched you in the longhall 3 weeks ago, kneeling in despair and believing you had nothing left. I realized that my silence was making me as guilty as my husband. And because," she gestured toward where Ulfar stood protectively near Eydis, "because I saw what real honor looked like when that man chose to protect you rather than profit from your suffering." The confession broke something loose in Eydis's chest, a knot of anger and grief that had been wound tight for 2 years. She had blamed herself for surviving when her family died. She had accepted the community's whispers about her supposed curse. She had nearly believed she deserved the isolation and suffering that followed. But none of it had been her fault. It had all been the deliberate cruelty of a man who valued gold more than blood. "What happens now?" she asked the Jarl, her voice gaining strength as the truth settled around her like armor. "Now we have justice," Jarl Olafsson replied grimly. "Thorvald Bjornsson, you stand accused of treason against your own blood, conspiracy with raiders, multiple counts of arson, forgery, and the murders of Born the Steadfast and his 3 sons. How do you answer these charges?" Thorvald looked around the hall desperately, searching for supporters who were no longer there. The men who had backed his legal claims wanted nothing to do with someone who had consorted with raiders. Even his closest allies were edging away from him as if proximity might spread his guilt to them. "I demand trial by combat," he said finally, invoking the ancient right that allowed accused men to prove their innocence through strength of arms. The Jarl nodded slowly. "Very well. Choose your champion." Thorvald's eyes went immediately to Ulfar, clearly hoping that some vestige of family loyalty might prevent the giant warrior from accepting the challenge. But Ulfar stepped forward without hesitation. "I will stand for the accusers," he declared, his voice carrying the finality of a death sentence. "Let the gods judge between truth and treachery." The stage was set for the final confrontation, but now it would be fought with full knowledge of what truly lay at stake. The trial by combat was set for dawn 3 days hence, allowing time for proper preparation and for word to spread to the surrounding settlements. News of Thorvald's treachery had already begun traveling the mountain paths, carried by traders and fishermen who understood that such revelations affected the safety of every community along the coast. Eydis found herself moving through those 3 days as if walking underwater, every sensation muffled by the enormity of what had been revealed. The grief she thought she had learned to carry had transformed into something sharper and more dangerous, not just sorrow for what was lost, but fury at how deliberately it had been stolen from her. She spent long hours at her loom, the repetitive motion of weaving helping to settle her mind while her hands created patterns of increasing complexity. The feast hall hangings were taking shape under her fingers, but the designs had evolved far beyond her original conception. Where she had planned simple beauty, she now wove story scenes of justice and betrayal, of loyalty tested and honor preserved. "You're putting your whole heart into those threads," Gudrun observed on the second afternoon, settling beside Eydis with 2 horns of warm mead. "They're becoming something more than mere decoration." "They're becoming truth," Eydis replied, pausing to accept the offered drink. "I want people to remember what happened here. Not just the trial or the combat, but what it means when a community chooses to see justice done despite the difficulty." The Gudrun studied the emerging tapestry with thoughtful eyes. "That section there, is that meant to represent the longhall?" Eydis followed her gaze to where silver threads created the suggestion of a great building filled with people. "It's the moment when Ulfar chose to stand with me instead of remaining safely silent. I want to capture how courage can change everything, even when it seems like the smallest possible gesture." "And this darker section? The betrayal. The raiders coming in the night, guided by someone who should have protected those they murdered instead." Her voice remained steady, but her hands tightened on the shuttle. "I won't let that evil remain hidden behind pretty lies." The 2 women worked in companionable silence for a time, Eydis weaving and Gudrun sorting wool by color and quality. The quiet was broken by the sound of steel on steel from the practice yard, where Ulfar was preparing for the combat that would determine not just Thorvald's guilt, but the course of justice for the entire community. "Are you worried?" Gudrun asked softly. Eydis considered the question carefully. "I'm terrified," she admitted, "not because I doubt Ulfar's skill, but because so much depends on the outcome. If Thorvald wins," she couldn't finish the thought. "He won't win," Gudrun said with quiet certainty. "I've seen Ulfar fight. More importantly, I've seen what happens when he has something worth fighting for. Thorvald is skilled enough with a blade, but he's fighting to preserve lies while Ulfar fights to serve truth. That matters more than skill alone." Through the window, they could see Ulfar moving through sword forms with the fluid precision of someone whose body had learned violence so thoroughly that it had become art. His practice partner, a young warrior named Eric, was struggling to keep up with combinations that seemed to flow like water while striking like lightning. "He's holding back," Eydis observed. "Even in practice, he's not using his full strength." "Ulfar always holds back," Gudrun replied. "That's what makes him dangerous. Most warriors fight at their limit and exhaust themselves quickly. He fights at perhaps half his capability, always keeping reserves in hand for when they're truly needed." As evening approached, Eydis found herself walking the settlement's paths again, drawn by restless energy that wouldn't let her remain still. The community felt different, now charged with anticipation and righteous anger that had replaced the earlier uncertainty. People who had whispered about her supposed curse now spoke openly about the injustice she had suffered and their shame at having doubted her. "Thora, the healer who had inherited Sigurd's loom, approached her near the harbor where fishing boats bobbed gently in the evening tide. "I brought you something," she said, holding out a small cloth bundle. "For tomorrow." Inside the cloth was a pendant of carved bone shaped like a tree, its roots and branches intertwining in patterns that spoke of endurance and growth. The carving was exquisite, detailed enough that individual leaves seemed to catch the fading light. "It's beautiful," Eydis breathed, turning the pendant to admire its craftsmanship. "Did you make this?" "Ulfar made it," Thora corrected. "He brought it to me yesterday and asked me to give it to you before the trial," he said. She paused, as if trying to remember exact words. "He said it was meant to remind you that some things grow stronger when they're tested by storms." The gift was unexpected and deeply moving, but it also carried an undertone that made Eydis's heart clench with worry. "Why didn't he give it to me himself?" "I think he wanted you to have something of his, regardless of what happens tomorrow," Thora said gently. "Warriors who fight for others sometimes make preparations that they hope won't be necessary." The implication was clear, and it sent ice through Eydis's veins despite the mild evening air. Ulfar was confident in his skills, but he was also practical enough to prepare for the possibility that confidence might not be sufficient. Trial by combat was never certain, no matter how skilled the participants. That night, Eydis sat by her window, watching the stars wheel overhead and thinking about the strange turns her life had taken. 6 months ago, she had been kneeling in despair, convinced that the world held no place for her. Now she wore a warrior's protection, created art that would outlast her lifetime, and had discovered strength she never knew she possessed. But all of it, the security, the purpose, the partnership that had begun growing between her and Ulfar hung in the balance of tomorrow's combat. If Thorvald somehow managed to win, she would not only lose Ulfar's protection, but likely face exile or worse. His victory would validate his claims and retroactively justify all the suffering he had caused. More than that, though, she would lose the man who had chosen to see her worth when everyone else had turned away. Ulfar had become more than her protector. He had become her partner in rebuilding a life from the ashes of the old one. The thought of losing that partnership, of returning to the isolation and despair she had finally begun to escape, was almost unbearable. She touched the pendant Thora had brought, tracing the carved lines with careful fingers. The tree's roots went deep, while its branches reached toward light, a perfect metaphor for the kind of resilience that had brought her through her darkest times. Perhaps that was Ulfar's real message, not goodbye, but a reminder that she possessed the strength to survive whatever tomorrow might bring. Near midnight, she heard quiet footsteps in the corridor outside her chamber. For a moment she considered calling out, but some instinct told her that Ulfar was walking his own path toward readiness and didn't need the burden of her fears added to his own preparation. Instead, she returned to her weaving, working by candlelight to add final details to the feast hall hangings. If these were to be her last hours in Ravnheim, she wanted to ensure that the tapestries were complete, a legacy of beauty that would remain regardless of what the morning might bring. The threads whispered through her fingers, silver and gold and deep blue coming together to tell the story of a community that had chosen truth over comfortable lies. As dawn approached, bringing with it the trial that would determine the fate of justice itself, Eydis worked steadily toward the completion of something, lasting in true dot by the time the first light touched the fueled waters. The hangings were finished. They would tell the story properly, preserving the memory of what had happened here for generations yet to come. Whatever else the day might bring, that much was secure. Now all that remained was to trust in the righteousness of their cause and the strength of the man who had chosen to champion it. The sun was rising, and with it came the moment of final reckoning. Dawn came clear and cold, with frost painting the settlement's rooftops silver and the fjord waters so still they might have been hammered metal. The trial ground had been prepared in the open space before the longhall. marked by ancient stones that had witnessed countless judgments over the generations. By the time the sun cleared the eastern peaks, nearly every soul in Ravnheim had gathered to witness justice done. Eydis stood with Gudrun and the other women near the hall's great doors, the carved pendant warm against her throat, where she had fastened it beneath her finest remaining dress. She had chosen to wear the deep blue wool that matched her original cloak, wanting to face this day as herself rather than as someone diminished by suffering. The crowd parted as Ulfar approached the trial ground, his massive frame moving with the controlled grace of a predator approaching prey. He wore simple fighting leathers rather than elaborate armor, trusting to speed and skill over heavy protection. Grimnir's bite hung at his side, the ancient axe's head gleaming with fresh oil and careful sharpening. Thorvald entered from the opposite side, flanked by the few men still willing to stand with him publicly. His equipment was more ornate polished mail that caught the morning light, a sword with silver inlay along its fore, a painted shield bearing his family's bear crest. He looked every inch the successful landowner, prosperous and confident in his righteousness. But Eydis could see the tension in his movements, the way his eyes darted toward potential escape routes before returning to his opponent. Thorvald was skilled enough with weapons, but he had never faced anyone of Ulfar's reputation in single combat. The knowledge of what he truly was, murderer, traitor, kinslayer, weighed on him like chains. Jarl Olafsson stepped forward to address the assembled crowd, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "We are gathered to witness trial by combat between Ulfar Ironside, champion of the accusers, and Thorvald Bjornsson, who claims innocence of all charges laid against him. Let the gods judge between truth and falsehood, and let their judgment be final." The ritual words had been spoken countless times before, but today they carried special weight. This was not merely a dispute between neighbors, but a reckoning with betrayal that had corrupted the very foundations of community trust. "Before we begin," the Jarl continued, "let the charges be stated clearly once more, so all may know what hangs in the balance." Ulfar stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "Thorvald Bjornsson stands accused of conspiracy with raiders, leading to the deaths of his brother Bjorn the Steadfast and Bjorn's 3 sons. He is accused of forgery, of bearing false witness, and of theft through deception. Most gravely, he is accused of kinslaying, the deliberate murder of his own blood for personal gain." Each accusation fell like hammer blows, and Eydis saw several people in the crowd cross themselves or make protective gestures. Kinslaying was the most serious crime in their culture, one that brought curse upon entire bloodlines if left unpunished. "And how do you answer these charges?" Jarl Olafsson asked Thorvald. "I answer that they are lies spread by a desperate woman and her protector," Thorvald replied, but his voice lacked the ringing conviction such denials required. "I call upon the gods to vindicate my innocence through strength of arms." The formal declarations complete, both men began their final preparations. Ulfar moved through a series of stretching exercises, keeping his muscles loose and ready. He seemed almost meditative, his attention turned inward as he prepared mind and body for the violence to come. Thorvald, by contrast, engaged in increasingly elaborate sword work, his blade whistling through complex patterns designed more to impress observers than to prepare for combat. He was trying to project confidence he didn't feel, hoping that showmanship might mask the fear gnawing at his courage. "Remember," Gudrun whispered to Eydis, "trial by combat isn't just about who wins the fight. It's about which cause the gods choose to favor. Right has strength that goes beyond mere skill with weapons." Eydis nodded, though her hands remained clenched with tension. She believed in justice, believed in Ulfar's skill and righteous purpose, but she had also learned that good intentions didn't always prevail against practical evil. Too much had been lost to chance already. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the morning mist and warming the trial ground. A circle had been drawn in the dirt, 20 paces across, marked with lime so that its boundaries showed clear and white. Ancient law dictated that combat must remain within those bounds. To step outside was to admit defeat and accept whatever judgment followed. Jarl. Olafsson raised his hand for attention, his gesture bringing absolute silence to the gathered crowd. Let the champions enter the circle. Let combat begin when I drop this cloth. Let the gods reveal their will through strength and courage. The white cloth fluttered in his raised hand like a banner of surrender, waiting for the moment when it would fall and set fate in motion. 2 men stepped into the circle, each carrying the weight of their choices and the hopes of those who believed in their cause. The moment of truth had arrived. The white cloth fell like a dying bird, fluttering to earth as 2 warriors circled each other with the deadly focus of predators measuring their prey. Thorvald struck first, his sword whistling through the air in a series of quick cuts designed to test Ulfar's defenses and establish the combat's rhythm. Steel rang against steel as Grimnir's bite deflected each strike with minimal effort. Ulfar's massive frame moving with surprising grace as he absorbed the initial assault. "Come now, giant," Thorvald taunted, breathing harder than he should have after such a brief exchange. "Surely you can do better than simply blocking. Or has protecting widows made you soft?" Ulfar said nothing, his gray eyes tracking every movement as he continued to slow circle around the combat ring. His silence was more unnerving than any boast could have been, and Eydis could see Thorvald's confidence beginning to crack under the weight of that steady, evaluating stare. The second exchange began when Thorvald lunged forward with a thrust aimed at Ulfar's center mass, following it immediately with a sideways cut toward his opponent's leg. It was a competent combination, the kind of attack that would have overwhelmed most fighters. But Ulfar simply wasn't there when the blade arrived. He had stepped aside with economic precision, allowing the sword to pass harmlessly through empty air. Thorvald stumbled slightly as his strike met no resistance. And in that moment of imbalance, Ulfar struck. Not with his axe, but with his shoulder. A controlled collision that sent Thorvald staggering backward toward the circle's edge. Only desperate footwork kept him from stepping outside and forfeiting the combat. Fighting like a tavern brawler now? Thorvald gasped, trying to regain his composure. "I thought you were supposed to be a legendary warrior." "Legends are built on results, not methods," Ulfar replied calmly, the first words he had spoken since entering the circle. Dead men care little about fighting prettily. The casual mention of death seemed to rattle Thorvald more than the near defeat had. He began attacking more aggressively, his sword work becoming less precise as desperation drove him to seek a quick victory. He threw combinations that left him overextended, committed to strikes that couldn't be recalled if they missed their target. Ulfar weathered the storm of steel with the patience of stone. Worn smooth by countless tides, his axe moved in tight patterns, never traveling farther than necessary, each deflection setting up potential counterstrikes that he chose not to execute. He was demonstrating mastery through restraint, showing the watching crowd that he could end the fight whenever he chose. The psychology of the demonstration was devastating. Thorvald's attacks grew wilder as he realized his opponent was toying with him, holding back strength that could crush him in an instant. Sweat beaded on his face despite the cool morning air, and his breathing became labored from exertion and fear. "Fight me properly," he snarled, launching a desperate overhead strike that left his entire torso exposed. Ulfar caught the descending blade on his axe handle, the impact sending shockwaves through both weapons. For a moment, the 2 men stood locked together, strength against strength, their faces inches apart. In that frozen instant, Thorvald seemed to truly see his opponent for the first time, not just a giant warrior of reputation, but the man whose cause was righteous and whose purpose was unshakable. "You know what you are," Ulfar said quietly, his voice audible only to his opponent. You know what you've done. Surrender now. Confess your crimes and face exile instead of death." "Never," Thorvald hissed, but there was desperation rather than defiance in his voice. They broke apart suddenly, Thorvald stumbling backward as Ulfar released the pressure that had been holding them together. The traitor's guard was completely down, his sword out of position, his body twisted awkwardly from the sudden change in balance. Ulfar could have ended it then. His axe could have taken Thorvald's head or split his chest before the man could recover his stance. Instead, he stepped back and waited, allowing his opponent to regain his footing and his weapon's position. The mercy was more devastating than any blow could have been. Thorvald realized that Ulfar was so confident in his superiority that he could afford to grant advantages, could offer opportunities for surrender, even in the midst of mortal combat. It was the gesture of a man who fought not from hatred but from necessity, who took no pleasure in the destruction of enemies. "Finish it," someone called from the crowd. Though Eydis couldn't identify the voice through the roaring in her ears, Thorvald looked around the circle desperately, seeking some escape from the inevitable conclusion. His allies had melted away, his supporters had abandoned him, and even the gods seemed to have turned their faces from his cause. He was alone with his guilt and the man who had chosen to be justice's instrument. "I yield," he whispered, the words barely audible. "Louder," Ulfar commanded. "Let everyone hear your surrender." "I yield," Thorvald shouted, throwing down his sword. "I confess. I confess to everything." The trial was over, but the reckoning had just begun. 3 months after the trial, when spring had begun its ancient work of transforming frozen earth into green possibility, Eydis stood in the doorway of her new home and marveled at how much the world could change when truth finally had room to breathe. The house that Ulfar had built for them sat on a gentle rise overlooking the fjord, positioned to catch both morning light and evening breezes. It wasn't large or elaborate, but every timber had been chosen with care, every joint fitted with the precision of a master craftsman who understood that homes were meant to shelter hearts as well as bodies. The walls were thick enough to keep out winter's bite, the windows placed to frame views of water and mountain, the hearth designed to warm both main room and sleeping chambers with a single fire. "You're thinking deep thoughts," Ulfar observed from behind her, his arms encircling her waist as he joined her in contemplating their small kingdom. His hands were rough with honest calluses from the building work, but his touch remained gentle, as always when it came to her. "I'm thinking about how much we've gained," she replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. "Not just the house or the land or even justice for what was done, but this," she gestured toward the life they had built together, the peace that had replaced the chaos of those dark months. The settlement below them had undergone its own transformation following Thorvald's confession and exile. The revelation of his crimes had shocked the community into recognizing how badly they had failed one of their own, and that recognition had sparked a determination to do better. Widows and orphans now received protection as a matter of course rather than charity. Disputes were examined more carefully before judgment was passed. The hard lessons of that terrible time had been learned and incorporated into daily life. Astrid had married a traitor from the northern settlements and departed Ravheim with her children, seeking a fresh start away from the shadows of her former husband's crimes. Before leaving, she had returned the deeds to Eydis's original lands, along with a letter of apology that spoke of sleepless nights and the weight of carried guilt. Forgiveness, Eydis had discovered, was easier when it was asked for honestly rather than demanded as a right. The feast hall hangings had been completed and installed to considerable acclaim, their intricate patterns telling the story of betrayal overcome and justice served. Visitors from other settlements came specifically to see the tapestries, marveling at their beauty while absorbing their message about the importance of protecting the vulnerable. Gudrun had been right. The work had transcended mere decoration to become teaching, a permanent reminder of what communities owed their members. The new commission from the northern Jarls arrived this morning, Ulfar mentioned, producing a rolled parchment from his belt. They want ceremonial banners for the autumn gathering, with payment in silver and goodwill. Eydis accepted the letter with satisfaction. Word of her skill had traveled far beyond Ravenheim, bringing requests from settlements throughout the region. She had become not just a weaver, but an artist whose work was sought by those who valued both beauty and meaning. "What about your boat orders?" she asked in return. Ulfar's return to shipbuilding had been gradual but increasingly successful. His reputation for quality construction, drawing customers who wanted vessels built to last generations rather than seasons. 2 longships by midwinter, and a merchant vessel for the spring trading season, he replied with quiet pride. Enough work to keep busy without becoming consumed by it. They had found balance in their new life, each pursuing meaningful work while building something larger together. Their marriage had been formalized 6 weeks after the trial, a celebration that brought half the coastland to Ravenheim for feasting and gift-giving. But the real wedding had taken place much earlier, in that moment when Ulfar had chosen to kneel beside a broken woman and offer his protection. "Do you ever regret it?" Eydis asked, a question that emerged sometimes when contentment made her wonder if such happiness could truly be deserved. "The choice you made that night in the longhall?" Ulfar turned her in his arms so he could look directly into her eyes, his expression serious despite the smile that played around the corners of his mouth. "I regret many things from my past. Battles fought for poor reasons, opportunities for mercy that I didn't take, time wasted on pursuits that brought no lasting satisfaction. But protecting you, choosing to stand with you against injustice, those are the best decisions I've ever made. Even though it meant giving up your freedom to wander?" "Freedom to wander aimlessly isn't freedom at all," he replied. "It's just another kind of prison, one with walls you can't see. This," he gestured toward their home, their life, the community that had learned to value both of them. "This is real freedom. The liberty that comes from choosing what matters and building something worthy around that choice." As evening painted the fjord waters gold and purple, they walked together through the small garden Eydis had planted behind the house. Vegetables grew in neat rows beside herbs for cooking and healing, while flowers added color and fragrance to corners that served no purpose beyond beauty. It was a modest plot, but it produced enough for their needs with surplus to share with neighbors. "The tomatoes are coming along well," Ulfar observed, checking the stakes he had built to support the growing vines. "We should have enough for preserving as well as fresh eating. And the loom in the new workshop is perfectly positioned for the morning light," Eydis added, nodding toward the separate building where she did her finest work. "I can weave complex patterns without straining my eyes." They were small satisfactions, domestic pleasures that might have seemed mundane to those who measured success in gold or glory. But for 2 people who had lost everything and found each other in the process of rebuilding, such simple abundances felt like the greatest treasures the world could offer. As stars began appearing in the darkening sky, Eydis touched the carved pendant that still hung around her neck, its familiar weight a reminder of the journey that had brought them to this peaceful moment. Sometimes the greatest courage was found not in fighting, but in choosing to begin again when the world insisted you had nothing left to offer. They had everything they needed, and more than they had dared to hope for. It was enough.